asking to teach.
Well,
Yeah, and the applications that come up here are, you know, you can make $4,500 to teach for a semester. And it's not literally just about the money, but time I had raise my kids, they're like 8 and 10, I want to spend time after my 9-to-5 job and teach. It's hard to do more than 40 hours and start in homes and they've asked me to school market. I think I'll find some way. I'm on the board at CIPA, which is the nonprofit. Like Robin? Like Black was everything there for last year. Sure.
And I googled that. The first day I got that.
She's been consider different physical spaces. Yeah,
that's right.
We've been fighting the space, and the spaces have been fighting us for a long time. No, the building owners want to put residences in other buildings.
So I
mean, it's hard to you may be right as a general.
well, of course,
It's like it's cold in the winter and
right, I bet. That's how I feel.
Now they are, they've recently got the collection of one of our
Okay. I'd like to begin by taking a page out of the book of my colleague and friend Mishana Goman, chair of the Department of Indigenous Studies at UB. At the Humanities Festival, she offered a land introduction rather than an acknowledgement, in which she called on us to reflect on our location and relationship to this land, which is Seneca, one of the one nation of the six among the Haudenosaunee. And she suggested that we learn more about how we've come to this area here together to listen, learn, and carry our learning forward. Today, this region remains the home of the Haudenosaunee people. It is covered by the Dish with One Spoon, Treaty of Peace and Friendship, a pledge to peaceably care and share for the resources around the Great Lakes. It is also covered by the 1794 Treaty of Canandaigua between the United States government and the Six Nations Confederacy, which further affirmed Haudenosaunee land rights and sovereignty in the state of New York. As an uninvited guest here, I responsibly take note of the continuing impact of settler colonialism on the Haudenosaunee and their territories. Our scholarly community values Indigenous cultures, histories, traditions, knowledge systems, and political entities, and we deeply appreciate the important role of Indigenous people in history, the present, and the future of our region, this country, and the world. I've got a few announcements for you from HI. Coming up this month, we have 2 new faculty seminars. This is a program that went dormant during the pandemic, but then we had this flowering of hiring, so we're sort of working through newer people, as many as we can. Both of these events will take place in the HI seminar room, which is 218 Clemens Hall. So on Wednesday, October 9th at 1 p.m., Meredith Palmer from the Department of Geography and Indigenous Studies will be speaking from her book manuscript, Dismembered Evidence, Colonial Geographies of Proof and Power. And on Tuesday, October 22nd at 12 p.m., we'll have Edith Gonzalez from the Department of Anthropology with a talk called We Carry It With Us, Does Shared Colonial History Equal Shared Cultural Heritage? Please also come to our next Scholars at Hallwalls, which is yet this month. Elizabeth Mazzolini will be speaking on, I didn't note down the date, but it's late October. The 25th of October, and her talk is called The Power We Squander, Paying Attention to 3 Mile Island, and details are on the website. And hopefully you're all getting our emails, but if you're not, go to the website, please, and sign up. And now to this afternoon's speaker. Óscar Gil-García is an assistant professor in UB's Department of Anthropology who trained in sociology first at Vassar College and then at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He studies the impact of immigration enforcement measures immigration enforcement measures have had on the health and well-being of Indigenous Maya families. He has worked with colleagues and student mentees in publications on the impact of zero tolerance on the health of families, how immigration policies exacerbate the vulnerabilities of stateless populations, and how photo voice can be used as a collaborative technology to challenge immigration and development policies that undermine global human rights laws. He studies these topics in Latin America and the Caribbean, and among Indigenous and Latine communities in the United States. Óscar is currently working on a monograph titled Legacies of Forced Migration. This book explores the ongoing aftermath of state violence inflicted on Indigenous Akatek Maya, who fled the Guatemalan Civil War and traveled to Mexico and the US. Legacies uses both first-hand accounts and photographs created in collaboration with Guatemalan Maya to document the cultural practices that shape community formation and advance social justice claims. As a public scholar, his research has appeared in The Conversation, the Los Angeles Times, and Salon, among other outlets. He has used his expertise to assist the United Nations in evaluating projects for a multi-million-dollar U.S. grant to promote it's in a multi-million USD grant, it's not from the U.S., to promote durable solutions for displaced populations and host communities throughout Central America. His talk this evening for us is titled Legacies of Forced Migration and Photographic Testimonio of Indigenous Maya in the Americas. Please join me in welcoming Óscar Gil-García.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. It's a sincere pleasure to share my research with you. I would like to thank everyone involved in coordinating this event, and of course, members of the Humanities Institute for selecting me to join such a distinguished collection of scholars whom I have the distinct privilege to engage in intellectual exchange in a convivial atmosphere. For today's talk, I will feature 2 working chapters of my monograph, Legacies of Forced Migration, and I have been informed that I have about 50 minutes for my lecture and look forward to receiving questions and constructive commentary during the Q&A. It is 2007, and I find myself sitting in the home of Gaspar and Amalia, a Guatemalan Akatek married couple I met while conducting field research at La Gloria, a former refugee camp that had been converted into an ejido, or communally owned land in Chiapas, Mexico. Gaspar and Amalia both fled the Guatemalan Civil War as children and then met at La Gloria. In 1997, barriers to legal status and work in Mexico compelled Gaspar to migrate to Oregon, where he worked in a garment sweatshop. Amalia raised pigs for sale and relied on remittances sent from Gaspar to cover the expenses needed to support herself and their newborn son, Javi. 3 years later, he returned to accompany Amalia to the United States. Fearful that Javi would not survive crossing the US-Mexico desert, he remained behind with Gaspar's parents. Amalia, too, worked as a seamstress in another garment sweatshop. Both parents missed their son and called him regularly. By 2002, both saved enough to allow Gaspar to travel to La Gloria to accompany 6-year-old Javi. Once again, just like his prior attempts, both relied on a coyote, human smuggler, to enter the US without authorization. The same year, Amalia gave birth to Gaspar Jr., Cacho. Reunification of the family came at a great expense. Payments made to coyotes depleted their savings. Their $6 an hour wages also left them with little income to cover the expenses of their growing family. Upon learning from Amalia's brother of higher paid jobs available at a slaughterhouse owned by Swift & Company, now a subsidiary JBS, the world's largest beef processor, the family decided to join him in Greeley, Colorado to increase their $10 an hour earnings and minimize the cost of childcare. Amalia worked the night shift. According to Gaspar, their co-workers were from all over Latin America, Mexican, Guatemalan, and Salvadoran. Due to the physical toll required to do this job, he added, it was very unlikely to find someone from the United States at the factory. The strenuous demands of this line of work increased during the summer months. To satisfy the American consumer demand for beef between May and July, Gaspar and Amalia joined other employees to work 6 days a week, slaughtering and butchering cattle, pork, and goat carcasses. By early 2005, night shift work was halted, requiring the couple to work during the morning shift. On December 12, 2006, 1 hour after the start of the 6 a.m. shift, the supervisors asked employees to halt work to join an impromptu general meeting at the cafeteria. Workers were also asked to leave their butcher tools, helmets, and uniforms at their workstations. Upon entering, they saw video cameras and immigration and customs enforcement ICE agents in riot gear and holding assault weapons who promptly asked workers to take a seat and not speak. ICE agents also directed blanket threats to workers who were advised not to use their cell phones. Those who did not comply, they warned, would face worse consequences. Bathroom requests required an escort, and to minimize the risk of escape or communication with someone outside, prisoners were asked to keep the stalls open and to relieve themselves with their shackles in place. ICE agents separated employees according to citizenship, residency, that is possession of an alien green card, and temporary work permits. The last group included those who used fake social security numbers. Unauthorized migrants can purchase social security numbers informally in clandestine economies. Some may receive one from their employer, while others may use one from a family member or friend who is authorized to work in the United States. As such a practice is criminalized, immigration agents threatened workers with charges of aggravated identity theft, carrying a 2-year mandatory prison sentence and a 5-month prison term for those who pled guilty. To avoid a prolonged sentence, both pled guilty and joined others in a fourth group. By 10 a.m., ICE officials processed all workers but took the personal belongings of 273 individuals who were shackled and herded onto buses separated by gender, bound to Denver, Colorado. A total of 12 hours passed before ICE agents provided nourishment. Many prisoners, upon arriving to the Denver Detention Center, were simultaneously deported. One ICE agent shouted the following message to deportees: "Tell the Mexicans and Guatemalans that we don't want you and don't need you here." Another agent, keenly aware of how December 12th is a religious feast day for the Virgin Mary, Guadalupe, celebrated throughout Latin America, chided prisoners and stated, "Pray to the Virgin Mary to see if she can save you." The Greeley raid was part of Operation Wagon Train, a 10-month investigation by ICE agents on the use of fraudulent social security numbers. The mass raid reflected the enforcement priorities of George W. Bush that involved the criminalization of entry and re-entry and new classes of felonies that apply only to non-citizens. Consequently, non-citizen nationals became increasingly susceptible to deportation and separation from their families. Scholars found that for every 2 adults apprehended in a worksite raid, at least 1 child, 2/3 of whom are US citizens, is impacted. Using the 2-to-1 ratio, we can estimate that Operation Wagon Train impacted 649 children. Like many families, Javi and Casho did not know what happened to their parents. 10-year-old Javi was at school, while Casho, age 4, remained in the care of a babysitter. They were unaware that their mother, along with 5 women and 12 men, were taken to a police prison in Greeley, Colorado. Amalia and Gaspar were permitted to call their family 3 and 2 days after detention, respectively. Both described hearing their children cry inconsolably for their parents. During her 2-month imprisonment, Amalia was approached by a public defender and was advised that she had 2 choices: forgo her rights to remain in the United States and be immediately processed for deportation, or contest her charges. If she pursued the latter, the public defender warned there was no guarantee of winning, which could result in a longer prison sentence. Fearful that she may not be able to see her children for an indeterminate amount of time, she signed a voluntary return document waiving her right to a removal hearing. Amalia shared that the forms were only in English, preventing her from fully grasping how signing this document triggered a bar to admission, precluding her from ever seeking legal entry to the United States. To her surprise, prior to her deportation, she was required to complete an additional 2-month sentence in a private detention center operated by the GEO Group, located in Aurora, Colorado. Gaspar received support from the United Food and Commercial Workers USCW Union Local Number 7, who paid for attorney fees to support more than 100 union members impacted by the raids. While Amalia was also a union member, the signing of repatriation documents precluded her from receiving counsel. Gaspar's attorney asked the court to release him and others to allow them to care for children or infirm loved ones who remained in the United States. After a 1-month and 10-day sentence and a $3,000 bond payment, Gaspar was freed. Upon release, Gaspar contacted friends, alerting them that he was in search for temporary work to cover the travel expenses required for him and his children to travel to Mexico to join his wife, who was scheduled to face deportation. Sympathetic to his dilemma, the friends provided him a job painting homes in Greeley, Colorado, and Wyoming, Montana. The compensation, half of his previous job, made it difficult to meet everyday expenses. The family's financial constraints were compounded by weekly $150 deposits sent to the Aurora Contract Detention Facility, which charges up to a 10% fee to refill Amalia's commissary account necessary to purchase food, hygienic products, and also calling cards. In April 2007, Amalia was deported to Tijuana, Mexico. To receive funds to cover the cost of travel to Chiapas, Mexico, Gaspar sent funds via Western Union. On May 21st, 2007, Gaspar and his children joined Amalia, becoming involuntary deportees. Our chance encounter 4 years after starting my fieldwork occurred at the home of Doña Micaela and Don Miguel, who are Amalia's parents. Since 2004, Doña Micaela and Don Miguel provided a bedroom for me to live to document the everyday experiences of La Gloria residents, where a majority, 80%, are indigenous and the minority are mestizos. As a majority originate from San Miguel Acatan, nestled in the village of Chimban in the department of Huehuetenango, Guatemala, most identify themselves as Akatek Maya. In 1982, Doña Micaela and Don Miguel left San Miguel Acatan. They are part of the older generation who fled the ravages of a scorched earth military campaign openly waged by the Guatemalan state and clandestinely supported by its allies. Doña Micaela and Don Miguel, like many community elders whom I interviewed, shared harrowing details of how the endemic violence that engulfed Guatemala in the 1980s required that they make the difficult decision to seek refuge with their children in Mexico. During the long and challenging years of exile, the couple lost one newborn infant and another teenage daughter in Chiapas, Mexico. The Mexican government's reticence to support arrivals compelled most of the remaining 6 children to emigrate to the United States. In early 2005, I met Gaspar's father, Alonso Mendez Feliz, who until 2015 served as a celebrador or catechist responsible for administering religious rites for the local Catholic Church. Along with his capacity as celebrador, Don Mendez has also taken leadership duties as community-wide representatives during the initial years of exile for a period of 15 years. As one of La Gloria's founders, the leadership roles of his father have been instrumental for Gaspar, who would later take on a major leadership role as an agente municipal in La Gloria. My established rapport with the parents of both Gaspar and Amalia allowed them to feel comfortable to share the difficult ordeal surrounding the 2006 deportation raid. Amalia and Gaspar agreed to have their portrait taken by my brother Manny, a professionally trained photographer, which we would use to inform a larger public of the harm caused by immigration worksite raids and to use the story to aid the family. Just before the portrait was taken, Gaspar Jr., who at the time was no more than 4 years old, gestured uncomfortably toward his mother and wept. In the next moment, as my brother snapped the shutter, a sense of dislocation set in. Suddenly, I was overwhelmed by a flush of memories, returning me incorporeally to my childhood home, where I witnessed the U.S. immigration raid. My breathing became a challenge, and my body tense. Before I could comprehend the flood of memories from my childhood, my attention was brought back to the scene before me. Amalia tried to console Cacho by telling him what happened. "Don't you see I'm here? We are safe." Despite her words, they did not appear to provide reassurance to the child who exhibited fear from a terror he could not verbally convey. Unable to articulate the source of his fear, it appeared that his body kept the score of his prolonged separation from his parents and now unfurled a chaos he just could not suppress. Gaspar walked toward me and apologized for initially agreeing to have their story and photograph recorded. Understandably, after seeing Cacho's physical and emotional reaction, he withdrew the offer. We agreed not to share their story or photograph and politely thanked everyone for their time. Several years later, I returned to visit the family, and this encounter would later inform their ultimate decision to share details of their ordeal. What prompted Gaspar and Amalia to reconsider their initial restraint to share their story? As I will illustrate, my ongoing support to La Gloria and neighboring community residents in addressing the spillover effects of deportations and family separations confirmed how my embodied and scholarly knowledge made me uniquely positioned to witness and amplify the voices of this family and others who continue to experience legacies of forced migration. Now, what methods could be employed to comprehend the ghostly presence of a memory that was empirically absent during that fateful day when Manny photographed Amalia and her family? Avery Gordon, writing on the ongoing affects that shape the structure of feelings that constitute modernity, argues that ghostly matters are part of social life. If we want to study social life well, and if in addition we want to contribute in however small measure to changing it, we must learn how to identify hauntings and reckon with ghosts. The process, she adds, is often painful, difficult, and unsettling. It became apparent that ethnography, a scientific method used in sociology and anthropology that privileged a positivist, detached empiricism, often used to study non-white others alone, simply could not answer. Instead, a more expansive, decolonial, methodological approach that values the embodied knowledge of all parties helped foster an environment where participants could shape the trajectory of our research. Indeed, my collaborators helped inform a research project that best reflects their needs. Unexpectedly, engaging in this democratic process created an environment where a childhood memory was unlocked and consequently became one of several unexpected findings in the field. To help explain this finding will require a brief explanation of the circumstances that led my brother and I to conduct research in the southernmost state of Chiapas, Mexico. As the eldest cisgendered son of migrants from the state of Puebla, Mexico, who grew up in a predominantly Afro-Caribbean Latine migrant neighborhood of Sunset Park in Brooklyn, New York, I became keenly attuned to the economic pressures and legal constraints faced by my migrant household. In the early 1970s, my parents obtained tourist visas to join relatives in New York City. Like many of the unauthorized population in the United States, they overstayed their visas, becoming what are legally and pejoratively defined as illegal aliens. They met and fell in love in the Big Apple. My father took on several jobs as a dishwasher, cook, and cab driver, while my mother worked as a domestic, janitor, babysitter, cook, meat packer, street vendor, and seamstress. Like many migrant families, my parents helped aunts and uncles who arrived from their hometowns with lodging and referred them to prospective employers. In 1980, my mother had given birth to my sister, Lorena. Like most unauthorized migrants who often are not provided with time off to care for newborn children, my mother had to quickly return to work at a sweatshop at the early morning shift. When both my parents' shifts coincided, my uncles Albino and Amilcar provided childcare. Late one morning, in the spring of 1981, my father picked me up from pre-kindergarten. As we approached our home, located across Industrial Bush Terminal, now Industry City, and the stone's throw from the now and later Candy Factory, two plainclothes immigration naturalization INS officers accompanied several individuals in handcuffs from a neighboring apartment complex to my right. These same officials placed the detainees in an unmarked van and intercepted my father asking for his proof of US residency. He simply answered that he did not have it in his possession. Frustrated with his uncooperativeness, they demanded without a warrant to take us into our home. My father, in a desperate attempt to warn my uncles, decided to not use his keys and instead ring the doorbell. According to my father, he thought the doorbell and the sight of two strangers standing behind him would prompt his brothers to leap through the back garden window to avoid capture. Yet, as Albino and Amilcar were both responsible for the care of my newborn baby sister, they figured that my father just forgot his keys and let us in. The next thing I remember was standing petrified as the officers proceeded to restrain my two uncles and father. From where I stood to the right, I could see my caretakers with handcuffs behind their backs as they stood facing the wall in the kitchen. In front of me and adjacent to this room was my 4-month-old sister who precariously lied on her back on our living room sofa. My father, concerned about Lorena, asked that I make sure that nothing happened to her. Despite my father's plea, the chaos that unfolded in front of me prevented me from walking toward her. I could not move and could not speak. I simply stood still. Unconcerned with my sister's safety, one agent remained in the kitchen, surveilling my handcuffed family members, while the others searched my family's belongings and took my father's social security card, passport, and Mexican military service ID. Previously, the foreign-born, upon providing proof of age, citizenship, or alien status, could obtain a social security card. After they searched my family's belongings, one of the agents insisted that they detain all the adults. After they searched my family's belongings, one of the agents insisted that they detain all the adults. My father, however, informed him that he secured an attorney who filed a petition for an employment-based visa, placing him in a liminal legal status. Upon hearing this information, the other agent wished to exercise a degree of discretion and suggested that my father remain behind. The disagreement prompted a phone call to their headquarters where a senior official ordered that my father remain behind. To this day, I do not remember the moment that my uncles walked out of our home in the company of both agents. I also do not remember my father's dejection at seeing his brothers taken away. For most of my life, in lieu of recalling this moment, all I could remember were my father's beatings and the saccharine aroma of manufactured confections that pierced throughout our dwelling. If liberal democracy had a scent or logo, now and later would be an exemplary candidate. Of this, I will say more later. For now, I will simply state that the redolent trace of molasses did not make my father's beatings, his way of showing discipline, any less palatable. These beatings increased after the immigration raid, which ultimately resulted in the deportation of my uncles. Maybe he tried to erase my memory of the raid. Or maybe, as Ta-Nehisi Coates writes in Between the World and Me, where he describes his beatings by his father, my father too was preparing me for the ill treatment I may receive in a country that dehumanizes migrants, people of color, and their families. Unsatisfied with postulating what may have shaped my father's behavior, I decided to ask if the raid informed why he directed so much corporal punishment on me. To avoid an accusatory tenor, I situated the question by first letting him know that I loved him and simply wished to understand and to help us heal. Unencumbered by guilt, my father entertained my question, and after a momentary pause, he confirmed that the raid did inform his rage. Neither my parents nor my uncles, both of whom returned to New York City after the deportation, ever mentioned the raid. How could they? To do so would make us ever more conscious that another deportation could occur now and later. The ever-present anxiety of family stability constituted one of several deportation burdens inflicted on my household. A few years after the raid, my parents had 4 more children. On weekends, to make ends meet in a growing household, my siblings and I became entrepreneurs and joined my mother as street vendors selling food at local parks. To maximize our earnings within our so-called ethnic economy, my siblings and I would compete with one another to see who could collect the most cans and bottles for recycling. Both our parents despite having a primary school education, saw it as a vehicle out of poverty. Before we left to school, our mother, a devout Catholic, would always tell us, persínense, pongan atención, pórtense bien, y que les vaya bien. Make the sign of the cross, pay attention, behave, and be well. As the eldest, she would also tell me, sé el ejemplo, be the example. I took this advice to heart. I studied hard, balanced multiple jobs, and sacrificed sleep for academic success. One of my high school teachers shared my scholarly achievements to a New York Daily News journalist who featured me in a week-long series titled The Exceptional Students. I recognize now how my efforts were not only to escape poverty, but to avoid confronting the trauma of my beatings and the immigration raid. Despite these efforts, I could not evade a series of somatic symptoms: shortness of breath, chest pains, and dysphoria, a pervasive numbness preventing me from fully engaging with those around me. An inexplicable and ever-present fear and anxiety prevented me from being fully alive in the present. While in graduate school, I shared information regarding these symptoms to my physician who prescribed Ativan, a tranquilizing drug that decreased my anxiety but made me lethargic. After a year, in lieu of taking this medication, I coped with exercise and playing the classical guitar. While these strategies were attempts to inhabit my body and take ownership of the self, the appearance of a vague incident in a critical moment when I was engaged in field work put into question my ability to distinguish between my memory and imagination. Basil van der Kolk, in his book, The Body Keeps the Score, Brain, Mind, and the Body in the Healing of Trauma, references psychoanalyst William Nederland, who argued how losing the ability to make distinctions between our memories and our imagination is a sign of what he called soul murder. Such an assessment, however, would mean a complete assault on one's ability to animate those around us, human and more than human relations. Might the haunting continuities that animated both Gasho's and my own visceral reactions be reflective of a desire to enunciate the toll caused by forms of structural violence? Or were our souls dead? The late anthropologist and medical practitioner Paul Farmer defined structural violence as violence exerted systematically, that is, indirectly, by everyone who belongs to a certain social order. The term is attributed to sociologist Joan Galtung, who identified how a clear intent to inflict harm is not required. Instead, institutions can normalize forms of exploitation within secular and religious cultures, ultimately resulting in immediate and long-term forms of physical and psychological violence that, along with constraining human action, can effectuate slow forms of death. My experience with the deportation rate and family separation and work with other families like Gaspar and Amalia provided deep insight on not only how slow forms of death take root, but also helped provide nuance on how families and communities resist multi-state efforts to separate families as a strategy to undermine a sense of community and well-being. Sharing my experience with you today is a byproduct of earlier efforts made by Chicanx activists in the late 1970s and early 1980s, where tribunals were created to allow families provide testimony to acts of violence committed by immigration authorities. More recently, undocumented and queer activists use the tactic of coming out employed during the gay liberation movement to disclose their queer and undocumented statuses to nurture a sense of community and devise strategies to make political claims of belonging and citizenship to the US state. Yet, as anthropologist Nicolas de Genova notes, when we narrow our analytic optic to study non-citizens as objects of study, as putative problems that require adjustment of status to a nation state, scholars and policymakers can perpetuate a kind of epistemic violence that precludes our ability to comprehend the contradictions inherent in liberal states. Heeding de Genova's suggestion to work with migrant populations to help us understand how states govern, my long-term ethnographic work with Akatek Maya helps us further comprehend the fundamental contradiction of liberal democratic states. That is, the discrepancy between the principle of national sovereignty, which implies the right to exclude anyone from citizenship or entry, and these states' professed commitment to universal individual rights. I will show how the tension between national sovereignty and universal individual rights can produce rightless subjects, such as statelessness, and how bolstered immigration policies produce spillover effects toward US citizens. Along with first-hand narratives, I also use photography to challenge dominant depictions of indigenous people, perceived as of a place, whereas migrants are perpetually out of place. These representations are foundational in establishing the logics of immigration control used to regulate state forms of political inclusion-exclusion. The goal of using photography in my project is to represent the everyday indignities inflicted by settler colonial states without resorting to the spectacle of violence and pain. Migrants are often rendered in photographs as either caravan invaders or anonymous victims. Guided by a critical or engaged anthropological lens, this project moves beyond the visual discourse of hopelessness and victimhood by advancing instead a decolonial counter-optics that involves stateless Guatemalan Maya directing how they wish to be photographed and pairing these images with their first-hand narratives. In 2014, I returned to La Gloria and reconnected with Gaspar and Amalia's family. During our conversation, I shared how their ordeal with US immigration authorities prompted me to remember the INS immigration rate in my home. I made no pretensions to equate their experiences with mine. Doing so would be a false equivalence, but simply renewed my desire to assist them. Within a few days, Gaspar shared how Amalia and 38 others living in La Gloria and 2 other nearby communities, also former refugee settlements, lacked any legal status. In effect, 39 men and women remained stateless in Chiapas, Mexico. Despite frequent communication since our initial 2007 meeting, the family never shared this information. Their reticence to not do so was indubitably shaped by the unequal dynamics that inform most ethnographic research. My possession of US citizenship bestowed privileges that could enable my ability to travel legally to Mexico, which is increasingly not available for others interested to travel legally to the US. To illustrate my commitment to assist the family and others, I introduced Gaspar, now an agente municipal, to an attorney and friend, Julia Torres. With Julia's help, we filed a grievance to the Mexican government regarding the prolonged delay in processing naturalization claims and legalization of 39 petitioners. To help pressure the Mexican government, Julia recommended working with a filmmaker, Luz de Alba Velasco, who recorded Amalia recounting her displacement as a child and settlement in La Gloria. The film, submitted to Mexico's National Women's Institute, was selected for second place from a national competition in 2015. As a top finalist, Amalia was invited to attend the awards ceremony in Mexico City, where she was to receive a temporary identity document that could enable her to obtain naturalized citizenship. Upon receipt of this document in front of journalists, Amalia stated the following: "I am happy, but there are many others who have lived through the same experiences that I have." Amalia alerted journalists that she is part of a larger collective who lacked legal status, who were also deserving of state recognition and citizenship. She strategically used a national stage to publicly air an ongoing grievance. Her announcement garnered national and international media attention and served to galvanize our collective efforts to obtain naturalization for all petitioners. The couple later recognized how using visual media strategically can help get their desired ends and joined 25 others to be photographed. The success of the film inspired one of the photographic components of my project. It also allowed me to learn how the right to nationality is undermined by states. The following is a brief definition of citizenship and nationality. These definitions reflect the dominant usage by the international system of states, which are constantly challenged by marginalized groups locally, nationally, and internationally. While the right of nationality is recognized by several international human rights protocols, there are no rules of international law which impose a duty on states to confer their nationality. The absence of an adequate enforcement mechanism in international law to ensure the right to nationality, along with armed conflict or generalized violence, and the hardening of immigration enforcement measures, has combined to increase the number of displaced populations that include refugees, internally displaced persons, IDPs, and the stateless. UNHCR, the body mandated with the protection of refugees and internally displaced persons, or IDPs, globally, only considers these populations as having been forcibly displaced. As stateless people are rarely forced to flee their homes, they are not considered as part of the global forcibly displaced population. A stateless person, unlike refugees or IDPs, are not considered a national by any state under the operation of its law. The diminished rights of belonging faced by stateless people reflect the experiences of these non-citizen populations and have compelled scholars to reconceptualize statelessness as forced displacement. Specifically, according to political scientist Christy Belton, statelessness is a form of forced displacement in situ. That is, one does not have to be physically pushed across borders or made to flee one's home within a state due to conflict, crisis, or persecution by to be forcibly displaced. Belton's thinking of forced displacement in situ is a helpful framework to de-link the assumption that the only way one can be displaced is through some type of involuntary mobility. Our work builds on prior scholarship on how the Mexican state created a series of bureaucratic procedures that granted temporary forms of legal presence to Indigenous Maya who fled Guatemala, but with reduced rights of membership to the nation. This liminal legal presence not only impacted those who fled military conflict, but also the second generation born stateless in Mexico, and as I will show, US citizens. In April 2018, the US government announced a new zero tolerance policy as a deterrence measure to help expedite the criminal prosecution of unauthorized migrants. The policy involved the use of enforced disappearance, subjecting many asylum seekers to family separations that often rip children from their parents and mandatory detention. A 2020 Physicians for Human Rights report studied the psychological effects of family separation experienced by asylum seekers. The report identifies how the policy involved the process of enforced disappearance, a crime under international law that deprived parents and children of their right to family integrity. The national and international condemnation of the Zero Tolerance Program has helped broaden public attention on the harm inflicted upon minors and parents by family separation. Less discussed, however, is how zero tolerance, like other United States deportation policies, impact US citizen youth who, like non-citizen minors, are subject to family separation. As close to 6 million children share a home with at least one undocumented family member, scholars have begun to identify how the involuntary removals of non-citizen parents produce unique vulnerabilities among Latina children and erode their citizenship rights. Luis Zayas has identified how immigration enforcement actions result in the production of two subordinate classes of Latina children, exiles and orphans. An exile refers to citizen children who leave the United States when their parents are deported or return to their country of origin due to fear of deportation. Zayas uses the term orphan to refer to citizen and non-citizen children who are separated from one or both parents as a result of detention and/or deportation by immigration authorities. Bolstered immigration measures have resulted in the production of more de facto exiles and orphans than at any point in US history. To frame the institutional process that constitute family separations, orphans, and exiles, I use a model of settler colonial theory that acknowledges the interplay of indigenous, alien, and settler positions in constituting processes of racialization in North America. I also use the theory of transnational alienage, which is a process of racialization in state enforcement of immigration laws that reconstitute indigenous Maya as non-citizens in the Americas. Recast as non-citizens, indigenous Maya, upon arriving to countries of origin as deportees, can be subject to forms of marginalization that constitute them as outsiders of the nation. My study employs a tripartite settler colonial model to examine transnational alienage, thus showing how states use immigration policies to suppress indigenous presence. The resulting settler colonial model will present a paradigm shift in the understanding of how US and Mexican border policies, often viewed as distinct phenomena, compound one another and enable the everyday violence experienced by Akatek Maya in the US and Mexico. Some of the research questions my study explores include: how do bolstered immigration measures throughout Mexico and the US, government's zero-tolerance policy, affect indigenous Maya? And how do indigenous Maya defy everyday forms of state exclusion to instead nurture practices of resilience? Now, to answer these questions, I employ Testimonio, a research method that involves the collection of first-person accounts with the aim to bear truthful witness to individual and collective forms of violence that can be leveraged as a consciousness-raising tool to elicit political change. While Testimonio has been used in poetry, music, and the visual and performing arts, it remains largely a text-based literary genre. My research also involved photography, ethnographic observations, in-depth interviews gathered over 36 months with 70 participants that included migrants, youth, and service providers. Of these participants, 26 included stateless indigenous Akatek Maya. I analyzed findings to document the harm inflicted on stateless and US citizen minors with Central American parents who face an impossible choice: deportation without their children or removal of their children from their country of birth. One such family who faced this impossible choice is Evelyn and Carlos. Their story elucidates how Mexican and US border policies enable the consolidation of power over the rights of migrants that keep indigenous Akatek Maya families apart generationally. We worked with Evelyn and Carlos along with 24 others to obtain citizenship in Mexico. Barriers to obtaining legal status and lack of employment opportunities in Mexico compelled Evelyn and Carlos to migrate to the US. Carlos moved to Alabama in 1998. Evelyn later joined him to work in an apparel sweatshop in 2000. Soon after their reunion, Evelyn gave birth to David in 2003, making him a US citizen. Between 2003 and 2007, immigration enforcement increased across the country, especially in southern states like Alabama. The rise of immigration and enforcement operations created increased anxiety for Evelyn and Carlos, who feared deportation and separation from their infant. To avoid this outcome, the parents agreed that it was best for Carlos to remain in the US and send remittances to Evelyn, who returned to Chiapas with David in 2007. Living in the United States without his family also proved difficult for Carlos, who returned to Mexico in 2009. Their reunification in Mexico coincided with the start of the Obama presidency. President Obama reinforced policies instituted by his predecessor, George W. Bush, who used the events of September 11, 2001, as an opportunity to cast immigrants as criminals and terrorists. Under President Obama, more than 3.2 million people were deported, impacting as many as 1.6 million children living in the United States. Concurrently, U.S. foreign policy promoted draconian immigration enforcement measures in Mexico, empowering Mexican federal police and military to detain and repatriate unauthorized migrants. Deep-rooted race, gender, and class hierarchies contributed to discrimination against legal residents and indigenous migrants. By 2015, Mexico detained and deported more Central Americans than the United States. Now, these circumstances caused Carlos and Evelyn to fear deportation to Guatemala and separation from their children, creating greater pressure to compel the Mexican government to provide legal status to participants. Despite enduring the force of US and the Mexican government's racial production of transnational alienage, indigenous migrant communities have developed strategies to respond. Our 2014 grievance filed with the Mexican government, along with a coordinated media campaign, helped Carlos, Evelyn, and Amalia to obtain Mexican citizenship in 2016. Yet, up to 27,000 who fled the Guatemalan War remain stateless. Following receipt of legal status, ongoing economic inequities in Mexico persisted, preventing several from obtaining formal employment. These circumstances motivated David to excel in school and to someday help his parents. On the morning of November 24, 2017, Carlos and David crossed the border in Sonora. Within 20 minutes, U.S. immigration border agents promptly identified them. Carlos, unsure if David's citizenship would grant him protection to remain in the country, asked border agents what would be required to obtain lawful entry to allow him to economically support the educational aspirations of his son in the U.S. To their surprise, immigration agents placed them in family detention. On the same day, a social worker provided the father a voluntary agreement form that allowed CBP agents to place David in provisional care with the Department of Child Services, DCS, in Arizona. Carlos faced over 2 months' detention and was deported in February 2018. In his study of zero tolerance, legal scholar Stephen Lee argues how family separation is a central feature of the broader U.S. immigration system. According to Lee, the zero-tolerance policy and the so-called ongoing crisis at the border comprises a part of a continuum of family separation harms that contributes to a slow death, the normalization of violence that exacts a toll on life and invites premature death. I use this concept to explore how the immigration system can inflict psychic and physical injury on citizens and non-citizens alike. According to Lee, slow death obfuscates, either by excluding harms from the public's view or else by foisting blame on individuals when they fall short of their pursuit of security, prosperity, and contentment. Litigation pertaining to David's dependency case and the Miss L v. ICE class action lawsuit filed by the American Civil Liberties Union challenging the zero-tolerance policy exemplify how slow death obfuscates and redirects blame on individuals. For instance, following David's placement in the child welfare system, the Arizona Attorney General's office filed a dependency case in April 2018 and accused both parents of abuse and/or abandonment. The abuse charges stemmed from DCS's claim that Evelyn and her husband coordinated a plan to smuggle their son across the U.S.-Mexico border without authorization. DCS charged both parents of abandonment based on their inability to provide food, clothes, housing, and supervision, along with economic support. Original court documents make no mention of how immigration authorities separated David from his father, who, along with his wife, are framed as negligent for their abandonment of David. DCS's framing of David's parents as neglectful in his dependency case mirrored arguments used to justify the U.S. government's separation of families under zero tolerance. Indeed, the most common justification used by the government to drum up support of zero tolerance was the protection of children from smugglers who purportedly use children as a cover for entry. According to Lee, prioritizing anti-smuggling and anti-trafficking laws to legitimate family separations is an extension of other enforcement programs designed to protect migrant children. For instance, the Special Immigrant Juvenile SIJ program enables state actors to step into a guardian role on behalf of migrant children who cannot be cared for by their parents. Migrant children who are admitted into the SIJ program can obtain a green card, but forego the right to sponsor parents, even if only one parent is found to be abusive. The SIJ program that seeks to protect migrant children established the foundational logic to actualize the zero tolerance policy. Lee argues that, like the SIJ program, zero tolerance obscures what scholars have called legal violence, that is, the internalization and normalization of social hierarchies through the law, allowing the state to associate parents with child smuggling as justification to obtain guardianship of children. In late 2019, U.S. immigration authorities revealed how more than 5,512 children face separation under zero tolerance. Notwithstanding the US government continued to justify family separations by claiming that such actions protect children after the Trump administration's end of zero tolerance. Once again, parameters of the law obscure forms of violence toward migrant families. As Lee states, the plaintiffs in the Miss L case did not challenge the government's ability to intercede on behalf of migrant children whose parents were found to be unfit. Rather, their argument focused on the fact that the government had not made the requisite finding of unfitness at all before proceeding to separate families. Consequently, the judge overseeing the Miss L case exempted reunification in cases where a child's safety was at risk, which has been broadly used to determine parental fitness. During a phone conference call with her court-appointed attorney in October 2018, Evelyn expressed her desire to challenge the state's accusation that she and Carlos abandoned their child. The attorney informed Evelyn that the court has to find one ground for David to be a dependent of the state. To support Evelyn's request, counsel advised that she not contest the state's claim that she allowed her child to cross the border without inspection with his father, to which Evelyn agreed. Later that month, Evelyn's attorney articulated her request to the Maricopa County Juvenile Court judge overseeing David's dependency hearing. The prosecutor representing the state acknowledged how both parents could not exercise parental care, which met the minimum ground required to obtain dependency, and agreed to drop the charges of abandonment and neglect. While Evelyn and Carlos were no longer framed as unfit to parent, the law excluded how the state denied Carlos his due process rights as a father to remain with his son. David's dependency case and the Miss L lawsuit illustrates how the law plays a central role in the continuum of family separation harms. These harms increasingly exacted a toll on all members of the family that became pronounced during David's prolonged foster care placement. Now, while the law legitimated family separation, David's foster care placement normalized slow violence under the guise of welfare. For instance, in the spring of 2019, David informed me how on 2 occasions following a midday nap, he awoke in a state of confusion and wondered where his parents were. David, visibly shaken from remembering several night terrors, embraced me and wept. Night terrors, a type of sleep disorder in which a person partially awakens from sleep in a state of terror, has been found to inflict children separated from parents under the zero tolerance policy. Along with night terrors, David mentioned loss of appetite, trouble sleeping, anxiety, and depression, all of which correspond with the effects of family separations experienced by asylum seekers identified in the Physicians for Human Rights study. In the absence of supportive mental health-related services, David attempted to cope through sports, spending time with friends away from the group home, and by calling his mother every day. In late February 2020, Evelyn was informed by her court-appointed attorney of California's approval of the Interstate Compact for Placement of Children, a requirement for placement consideration of David in his uncle's home. The change of physical custody granted in early March of 2020 allowed David to join his uncle in California by later that month. The reunion, however, coincided with the rapid spread of COVID-19. Unfortunately, information concerning David's unstable psychological and somatic symptoms was never shared by DCS to his uncle before or after the transfer of custody. Additionally, as California's Department of Child Protective Services had not assigned a social worker for David, the uncle was left without guidance on how to enroll his nephew to school or for health insurance. The lack of coordination between foster care agencies and David's uncle left him more susceptible to harm, particularly during the pandemic. By bearing witness to the violence of family separations, the accounts shared by families in this presentation contributes to a larger testimonial tradition that makes an ethical appeal to a wider public. To seek substantive justice to redress the social suffering of migrant families who experience the trauma of family separations. Such a call is evidenced by David, who courageously agreed to share his harrowing ordeal in October of 2022 with journalist Jacob Sabaroff. David's interview was featured as a major news story and helped expand inclusion of U.S. citizen minors in a major class action lawsuit against the U.S. government for its participation in the separation of up to 1,000 U.S. citizen minors under zero tolerance. The lawsuit pressured the US government to expand inclusion of US citizen minors as class members of the Miss L v. ICE lawsuit. David's story and that of his family provides insight not only on the profound suffering deliberately caused by the US government, but also everyday courageous acts of resistance that attempt to defy the slow death inflicted by zero tolerance. Writing on the discriminatory burden by the state of Texas to preclude the children entry to public schools, Supreme Court Justice William Brennan authored the court's 1982 Plyer v. Doe decision stated imposing its discriminatory burden on the basis of a legal characteristic over which children can have little control. It is thus difficult to conceive of a rational justification for penalizing these children for their presence within the United States. This situation raises the specter of a permanent caste of undocumented resident aliens encouraged by some to remain here as a source of cheap labor, but nevertheless denied the benefits that our society makes available to citizens and lawful residents. Justice Brennan's statement regarding the specter of a permanent caste is applicable to the condition of US citizen exiles who may reside for years abroad. Scholar Luis Sayas and his analysis of the impact of US immigration policies, their impact on orphans and exiles, states that deportation exiles deserve the offer of redress from the United States. Failure to do so, he adds, will carom throughout the population as a whole. As earlier mentioned, Castro is one of 500,000 US exiles who now live abroad. Following Amalia's receipt of legal status, I continued to work with them to obtain information from the US State Department to allow their son to travel in the company of a family friend. Despite living apart from his parents, he completed his high school education in Colorado. Yet without nearby role models, he was unfamiliar on how to access university education, and currently works doing manual labor and sends remittances to support his parents. By way of conclusion, my work with Indigenous Maya reveals the calls into question liberal states' professed commitment to universal individual rights in the paradoxical context of the US government's permitting the ongoing violent separation of families. Thank you so much.
Shall I bring up the lights and then you can
Sure,
take
yeah,
questions?
thanks. Yes.
Thank you so much for the talk, Oscar. It's great. I was just wondering about the photos you've taken, and you're thinking about Testimonio.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering if you see the photographs, or if you would like to envision, or think of the photographs that you have as examples of Testimonio, and if so, how would those photographs that you have circulated, how might they serve as Testimonio?
Thanks for the question. The way that I'm thinking about the photographs that were taken, the ones that you saw, there are two ways that I'm thinking about it. There were really two stages in the way that I worked with photography in the field. The first stage involved distributing single-use cameras and allowing the participants to actually document their needs. I identified a couple of criteria that were identified by prior scholarship that included festivities, things of importance, things that they would like to improve in their community, things that they find are assets, right? And once we developed the film, I opened up the photographs and allowed them to identify the meaning in each photograph, right? And then we narrowed it down to which ones are your favorite, and by doing so, we provide them the ability to break down this knowledge-power relationship where the scholar is all-knowing, and instead allow the participants to really define what is most important to them, right? So that part of the project involved working with about 16 youth in the local high school. So I worked with teachers too to enable that, right? And that allowed me to then meet family members through the children. And that opened up the opportunity to then work with other members of the community, adults. So the second stage, thanks to working with single-use cameras, allowed for the latter stage of the work that you saw here, these larger portraits, right? Because many of the families had already seen me using single-use cameras with community members, right? So with my brother, and only after we were informed that there were 39 people that were stateless or so, and I can elaborate a little bit further as to why others declined to continue to work, but ultimately we worked with 26 who said that, you know what, we want to continue with this project. We feel that we could get legalization and we can use these photographs to increase attention in regards to ongoing statelessness by many people in southern Mexico. So in the process of using these photographs, I had no idea that we would also find out that children were also stateless. So initially, I was told that there were 27 individuals that ultimately decided to work on getting legalization with Julia, right? But in the process of taking these photographs and interviewing them, we also found out that there were children because Mexico can only provide citizenship to a child if both parents have belonging to the nation state. Since many of these people did not have that circumstance, when both parents didn't have state citizenship, they could not receive any kind of documentation for their children. So in essence, through working with this population, we were also able to get citizenship for these children. So in a sense, my way to answer your question would be that Testimonio operates through the use of the camera in enabling and enabling a deeper sense of relation with the participants and allowing them to have control, some degree of control in regards to the narratives that are shared through the work that we do. Thanks. Yes?
Thank you so much for your talk. And I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the comment that you made about engaged anthropology, because my sense was that your critique of the paradox of the state about universal individual rights in tension with the principle of national sovereignty, in my mind, rhymes a bit with the implied critique of a social science like anthropology, and probably sociology and other social sciences. In that, they're sort of based on this idea of like everyone is the same, but not quite, you know, like we are the studiers and you are the studied still. And then when you're calling attention to your position, both because of your personal history, but and also because of your, you know, relation to the people and experience with the people and stuff like that, and how that translates to engaged anthropology. I guess I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about those disciplinary stakes, or about the stakes for social science, given the observations that you've made about the state. Like, I wonder if some of your critiques apply to the discipline, I guess is what I'm wondering.
Yeah, thanks for your question. Absolutely. My work builds on scholars that are calling for a decolonization of the disciplines, where in some of my latest work with my mentees and colleagues, we are engaging with the ongoing replication of methodological nationalism is what, you know, is used, where we accept that as a given in the work that we do and don't critique the nation state across the disciplines, as you mentioned. So absolutely, so the work that I'm trying to promote here is to question the stability of the nation state and show the resilience of these indigenous Maya, to show to us how the state purposely creates conditions of statelessness and puts us in jeopardy. And even more so as we see the ravages of climate change. And this is what is prompting me to think about this even more critically. Amitav Ghosh, who recently I've been reading, alerts us to the peril that we face if we don't think more deeply about the nation state and the limitations of thinking about belonging within these contexts of citizenship, right? When within our lifetimes we're going to see island nations be submerged underwater. And how are we going to allow these individuals to seek belonging if we are still replicating the same frameworks that systematically exclude so many? Thanks. Yes?
Thank you so much, Oscar, for this really powerful presentation that beautifully with your personal analysis into this structural one. So my question is, and also here I can see definitely the disciplinary difference between sociology and anthropology. I welcome this, engaged in anthropology, but in sociology, at least in some of the fields, sometimes it's tricky to position yourself into the narrative, but I really, really appreciate what you did. So my question is, I want to hear a little bit more about your take on the state, because here the state is actually has a very strong agency here, but also it's not a monolithic entity. So
right.
In what way you can you were able to unpack it through your methodology? For instance, have you done court ethnography in some way? Because what struck me was this is really what they do, right? It's really horrible and alienating and violent. However, there are individuals who are, who are the prosecutors, right? Who are enforcing, right? These cruel, ruthless practices. So, in what way does your work address that side of the story to make sense of the individual decisions which collectively have produced these violence?
Yeah. So I think I try to do that by paying close attention to certain actors of the state, be it judges, attorneys, who negotiate with, say in the case of Evelyn, where they're trying to disable her and her husband from having parental relations with their son, right? And in that instance, we see how she still contests this notion that she is an unworthy parent, right, who abandoned her child, and how the state uses notions of abandonment to get around the ongoing separation of children, right, without necessarily using overt language, and in regards to the Mexican state, you're right. I mean, each state is different in regards to how it operates forms of exclusion to members within its national nation-state polity, right? And I'm trying to be acutely attuned to how Mexico also does that in different ways, but also increasingly under the pressure of the United States that plays a geopolitical role in pressuring Mexico to inflict increasing forms of exclusion within its national territory, right? So there are these geopolitical dynamics that are going on as well. It's to no surprise why now Mexico deports more Central Americans, as I mentioned, than the United States. That's actually a byproduct of development. so-called development, where the United States sends money for that express purpose. So yes, absolutely. There are different state actors here, but they are both implicated in different ways on how enforcement operates on the ground. Hal?
If I want to second Iga's comments about your powerful talk. I was really moved by it, and that's usually when I come away from most academic talks with. And I just want to commend you for the stories you're telling and your courage in sharing them with us. And it's just a real testament, I think, to the need to work on colonial methodologies. And how much we can miss by hewing to simple positivist empiricism and elevating that methodology above all others. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
So, I'm a colonial historian of colonial Latin America, and I can't help but put your talk in the context of how I sometimes teach my students about the Maya, and I'm thinking about your ideas about memory and imagination, and of course, Maya carry the memory of violence and trauma that goes so deep and
Right.
so much beyond the Guatemalan Civil War, of course. I mean, in some ways, they've been created as stateless people from the 16th century on, right? And so I'm wondering if that has any bearing on your understanding of Maya memory. That is, do your subjects carry any sense of a longer history, a deeper sense of trauma, even than the sufficient trauma of the Guatemalan Civil War? If so, how do you tap into that? If not, can you explain why there's a certain generational limit on what your subject's understanding of their past as stateless people might be? And as an addendum to this, the question of testimonio. When I look at testimonio in the 16th century, it's often coerced testimonio. It's often a kind of being called on to rat out others in Inquisition trials or in legal actions brought against other Maya. And so I wonder what kind of, some of your subjects want to give their testimonies, others retreat from it, and I'm wondering if that ambivalence about testimonio, if you could comment on that.
Thank you. First, really appreciate your opening remarks. Really means a lot to me. And yes, to the question about the longer legacy of violence and harm that these individuals expressed to me. They were not just limited to talking about the violence of the Guatemalan Civil War. They talked about ongoing violence beforehand, but they never really tapped per se on that longer legacy of colonialism per se verbatim, right? But that's why I'm using the term ghosts here to talk about this longer legacy that you're trying to allude to here, because absolutely I'm not oblivious to how forms of violence predate the Guatemalan Civil War. And the way I'm trying to do it is in a separate chapter where I'm talking about a pageant, which is where I concluded this photograph. This pageant is a pageant that happens every year in late September. And the pageant allows the community to define its origin and beginning, and also allows them to talk about the forms of violence that caused them to flee from Guatemala, right? And while they do that, they don't talk about this longer legacy of violence that you talk about, right? So they instead talk about the beauty of the garments that you see here that are from time immemorial, despite the fact that, like you said, scholarship indicates that colonization had a lot to do with how these trajes, as they call it, look like, right? So, in a sense, scholars, I'm being attuned to that longer legacy of violence, but at the same time, on the ground, when folks were talking to me, they were just locating the forms of violence on the conditions that led them to flee from Guatemala with their children and the few belongings that they had. And that was periodic in most of the conversations that I had, without even asking it per se. They would just share it, right? And but this pageant, I'm using it as a vehicle to talk about how they share the trauma of violence, but also use it as an affirmation that they are still resilient enough to be here in Mexico, belong in Mexico, that they have forms of belonging that transcend these borders. So they're also speaking back against the nation state, right? But in a strategic way, because they still have the flag behind them. They salute the Mexican flag. They don't salute the Guatemalan flag. They salute the Mexican flag. So they're very strategic on how they perform indigeneity to still belong within the confines of the nation state, right? So I think these forms of performance are captured through the photography that we use as a form of testimonio, as a form of resilience. But I absolutely agree with you. Forms of violence precede the Guatemalan Civil War. So in no means do I want to allude to that that's the case. Thanks. Yes, and
thank you. And I just want to echo what a number of my colleagues have said in terms of, you know, the powerful quality of your testimonio, as well as how you've woven that into the testimonio of these of your subjects. I wanted to sort of pick up on something you just said in terms of photography and performance, because I'm really interested in how you're using photography to, as you said, sort of capture a performance here, or sort of index something. But I'm also curious to ask whether you're also thinking about these photographs as a means of performance, or as a way for your subjects to sort of perform themselves. Here I'm sort of just thinking about how the aesthetics of photography have been used historically. For instance, in 19th century African American culture, it was a space of sort of self-fashioning, or so Frederick Douglass poses very strategically for photographs to sort of counter narratives about him.
sure.
Enslaved people pose for photographs to show the brutality of slavery and what it is wrought on their bodies. And I'm also thinking of contemporary South African photographer Zanele Mokole, who has a project of photographing queer, lesbian, trans subjects in South Africa, where she asks people to pose for her camera, and they do so very willingly, and it's a moment for them to sort of perform themselves to a much wider audience. So I'm wondering how you're thinking about performance as a vehicle for performance, or self-fashioning, or for your subjects to present themselves in certain ways.
Yeah, thank you. So yes, I have been engaging with thinking about photography as performance, and I've been reading Caitlin Murphy, memory mapping. She uses the term to think about how there's this ongoing performance that is implicated in photography. And so I'm still engaged with that literature, and I'd love to talk to you more after, as we proceed in the semester and thereafter, to talk a little bit more about how I can incorporate that thinking and writing into my work, because that's this other arena that I'm not as an expert in, but absolutely I am open and thinking about how performativity is inherent to the medium of photography, but of course also being in tune with how it's been used in ways that reinforce racialization and the sexualization of others and marginalization. But here, of course, there's also, as you put it, the owning of the technology in a way that's empowering, and that's certainly what I've seen, the way that they also use the cameras on their own that we distributed, which of course I didn't speak about today, but happy to talk to you more about this topic. Yes?
Thank you for the talk, and I apologize because I feel like these questions have been like so sensitive to the specificity of your approach, and I'm going to ask you to go in a different direction.
Sure.
Because one of the things I was really struck by was a certain kind of parallel between the structures that you were sort of implicitly pointing to and the tensions that Iga was talking about a couple of weeks ago, in that, your account of the structure, the violence that's built into the way that the liberal state defines itself. Like, totally accept that, right? Like, you have rights within the liberal state so long as you are within the charmed circle, and what that means is that there are those who are without the charmed circle, right? But there's also capitalism. And one of the things that has really struck me, especially in some of the recent debates about deportation and Trump's whole rhetoric about, we're going to deport everybody and her sister, is that will actually trash our economy, right? And when you're talking, like, you kept coming back to sweatshops, and the dirty secret of, which is not a secret, is that our country's economy is absolutely dependent on these subsistence wages, right? And so I'm just wondering sort of how you think about that tension between a kind of capitalist self-interest, which would, sort of turn a blind eye, and I think often does turn a blind eye, to the fact that we have lots of undocumented folks who are doing essential work, right? And then this whole rhetoric of deportation and the actuality and the tragedy and the kind of horrific celebration of violence that was involved in the family separation at the border, like that whole, like the moment of, filming children in cages and families separated, like that seemed like so grotesque. But there's a kind of disavowal there. So I'm just wondering how you're thinking about that tension, or whether that's something that's sort of come up in your work. Does that make sense as a question?
So if I could encapsulate your question, how am I thinking about capitalism, one, and how is it that, is there another part? How am I thinking about capitalism?
No, and basically it's like, how do you understand this contradiction between different forms of thinking about the state, right? If you're thinking about the state as in terms of liberalism and in terms of citizens as rights bearers, this agenda makes sense. If you think about it in terms of the capitalism, and if you think about it in terms of economic self-interest, it makes no sense.
Okay, thank you.
Does that
I thank you for encapsulating that. To answer that question, it makes complete sense, and that's my point. And it's not illogical. And capitalism is certainly involved here. While I may not have used the term per se, right? I certainly, had I had more time, which certainly I'm not about to do that, but in the classroom, I would talk about Goulash Boza's excellent work, thinking about how neoliberalism is involved in this capitalist cycle that allows for the reproduction of non-citizens, not only in the United States, but globally. right? Where the deportation of people is a logical part of capitalism. It is not a tragedy either. It is part of the system. And that is how I'm speaking back to this liberal model that frames circumstances like these as tragic. They're not. They are part of the system. And yes, thank you, absolutely. Capitalism is implicated here. And there are these mystifications that are used to prevent us from looking at the complexity that is important, to include also capitalism as part of that picture. So thank you.
Great, thank you.
Do you want to maybe take one more?
Sure.
And then we can go informal.
Thank you. Someone else?
Last question.
Yeah.
I'm just kind of building off the questions, Hal and Kellen's questions about the Testimonio and your, as a storyteller, just listening to sort of these harrowing tales that you've built into your presentation are remarkably effective, right? I think. Thank you for sharing them. Can you talk a little bit about using your brother as your photographer?
Yeah.
Because it seems like, it's good to keep them fair.
Yeah.
But it also seems like there's a necessary trust given
Yeah, God.
situations of precarity.
Yeah.
And so, I'm just kind of curious about
Absolutely,
that.
and thank you for your question. Manny, thank you. So Manny has been incredible in this journey. He's grown a lot as a photographer, and he was present during the interviews. That's what makes these photographs so visceral, because he met them for years. It's not like he just came in for an assignment and then he left. In full disclosure, my brother is a lot more engaging than I am. He's more outgoing. He's really talkative. And whenever I would go somewhere, they would always ask me, "So where's your brother? Where's Manny?" Right? Because he would bring the fun. He would be very lively, and I'd be the scholar. I'd listen, right? But he would bring that kind of energy, and that really allowed us to really gel well with the community members, right? Of course, we bumped heads sometimes in regards to what would happen in the field, and yet he would listen, thankfully, and he would be open to the larger history of photography. And that's what I came in to tell him, because unfortunately in his training, this is what led me to want to work with him, is that I saw his training in photography as limited to the production of models in a certain way and not have knowledge of this larger history that race has played and how photography has been used. And then I told him, we can use your medium in a way that is empowering. How about we work on this together? So thank God he was open to that. And he was open to continuing to work with these individuals. And like I said, for many years, maintained connections. And he was open to traveling to Arizona, where we saw David. And he was also kind enough to fill out the FBI clearance reports along with my wife, who's here, thank God, where we collaborated in being able to have access to these foster homes that are largely privatized, right? That would have prevented us from seeing David in Arizona, right? So he was thankfully willing to go there because, and here's the important thing, and I'll conclude with this, that we knew multiple generations of people. The only way that we would have this deep relationship with Gasho and David is that I knew their great-grandparents. I was there during the death of someone, the great parent. And I was there to listen to the harrowing tales of fleeing Guatemala, the grandmother, right, who, as she was preparing a meal for us, and there was my brother photographing the grandmother killing a chicken, and here we are, deeply engaged with these families every single day, multiple generations that allowed us to have access to youth. He was the closest photographer compared to everyone else because we knew her grandfather, who was raising her since infancy, that my brother captured when she was running with her younger brother, and she was being raised by her grandparents while their parents were in Ohio, and shared that photograph with this young lady, and only then were we able to then realize, oh, she's a candidate for being princess. And then the grandfather said, you know what? Yes, she is. Would you like to come back to record that? Miraculous, because we knew multiple generations, because my brother had this deep relationship. I don't think any photographer would have been able to get this type of insight and connection that my brother had he not gone multiple times and met multiple generations.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you.
Is your brother listening?
He might be. I hope so.
Thank you, like
Yes,
he would- like
thank
he was
you.
the voice
Yes,
of
he said
God.
he would log in. Yes, he
Hey,
would.
Mandy. We hear you're fun.
Yeah. He is. Thank you.
Nice.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Appreciate
much,
it.
really.
Yeah,
Can
of
I give
course.
you a hug?
Yeah.
That was
Thank you.
really, that
Thank
was
you.
so lovely.
Appreciate it.
So,
Thank you.
Yeah. And intense, right?
Thank you.
That was
Yeah.
intense.
Hi.
Hi, Rachel
Hey, Rachel.
I'm so sorry we haven't met before
Yes.
in person.